Playing through Final Fantasy XVI was a really weird experience for me. I'll admit that I was impacted by where I was in my own life way more than what the game laid out before me. I couldn't help but think about the fact that the last mainline entry in the series, Final Fantasy XV, released 7 years ago, and we probably won't get Final Fantasy XVII, if that's even what they call it, for another 7. I'm also in a bit of a stressful transition period in my life and don't exactly love consuming dark media, whether that be movies, shows, or games. I knew going into Final Fantasy XVI that it was going to be very mature with themes of revenge, but I did not expect the story to be as dark, depressing, and joyless as it was. While Final Fantasy certainly has its dark moments and heartbreaking character deaths, it often balances those out with moments of levity. This is the series that brought us the infamous cross-dressing chapter in Final Fantasy VII, the starlit ballroom dance of Final Fantasy VIII, the purposefully silly laugh in Final Fantasy X, and Saz, a character that has a baby chocobo nesting in his afro in Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XVI has none of that. From beginning to end, it's oppressively grim, almost completely devoid of levity in the nearly 40 hours I spent with it. I found it very difficult to play for more than a few hours at a time, as I was so sick of watching characters die, suffer, and endure their miserable existences. I see enough of that in real life and don't want to experience that same sadness in one of my favorite gaming franchises. While the game has undeniably high production values and one of the best action combat systems I've ever played, in the end, I don't think I really enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy XVI.
He takes too many risks. I only wish I could save him from himself.
I know anyone watching this video will be wary of story spoilers, so I'll do my absolute best to avoid any of them here. Final Fantasy XVI centers around Clive Rosfield, one of the royal princes of Rosaria. At the young age of 17, he's trained to be a shield, Rosaria's elite guard. In particular, the shield of his younger brother Joshua. Joshua is special because he's the dominant of the Icon Phoenix. Icons are essentially Final Fantasy XVI's version of the series' iconic summons. Dominants can utilize their power and even transform into them. Joshua, however, is frail and can't be outside too long without feeling sick. Their mother resents Clive for not being chosen as Phoenix Dominant, as he's much stronger and would have been able to utilize that power better. Because of this, Clive is trained extra hard to prove himself as a warrior. The game does a great job of framing this, as early on, Clive leads 2 other older soldiers on an important mission. You'll find yourself rooting for Clive to succeed, as it's clear that he wants to prove himself. I even found myself rooting for the 2 soldiers with him and hoping they would survive. Character building is certainly one of the strengths of Final Fantasy XVI's story. While the core cast is relatively small, they're all fleshed out incredibly well. By the end, you'll find yourself caring for even the most minor of characters. To say any more about the story itself would risk spoiling it, but essentially it becomes a journey of revenge for Clive. And while you might think you know what the story's about from the trailers, it twists and turns in so many wild ways that you'll never be able to predict where it finishes up by the end. In terms of the story's presentation and production value, it's nearly unrivaled compared to the rest of the series. The animation, cinematography, and voice acting are all top-notch, genuinely some of the best you'll find in any AAA game. That said, the pacing of the story is quite rough. The opening hours found in the demo are brisk and well-paced, but after that it slows to a crawl. The game has gaps upwards of 5 hours before it feels like it has anything of substance to share. I feel like part of the problem is how Final Fantasy XVI is designed. It feels quite dated, as you'll find yourself moving from combat arena to cutscene in a pretty regular cyclical manner. After a handful of hours, you can almost predict when the next cutscene will happen. The game's stop-and-go nature starts to feel frustrating as the game goes on, with some cutscenes lasting upwards of 15 minutes. Other modern AAA games have found ways to seamlessly blend gameplay and story, or at the very least keep their cutscenes brief, and in that sense, Final Fantasy XVI feels old. One area where the game does innovate is with a feature called Active Time Lore. It acts in a lot of ways like Amazon Prime Video's X-Ray feature. During any cutscene, if you pause the game, it'll bring up key characters, locations, and plot elements for you to review in real time. This was an incredibly cool and helpful feature, as there were times where it wasn't clear what was going on exactly, or how certain story elements connected with certain characters. I only use it sparingly during my time playing, but it was a welcome feature that I suspect will pop up in future RPGs across the industry. Now, before moving on from the story, I do want to touch on the game's darker tone. My opinion on this is going to be very subjective, so please don't let it deter you from playing the game if you enjoy darker stories. Final Fantasy XVI is so unrelentingly somber. It felt like it was just one horrible thing happening after another, whether it be a character death, a villain foiling the hero's plan, or everyone generally being miserable. I wasn't expecting the cast to do a cabaret number, but I was, at the very least, waiting for them to just have a moment to catch their breath, put their feet up, or have a beer together. But that almost never happens. Because of this, I found myself myself struggling to keep playing at times. Why should I keep pushing forward when I know I'm just going to watch these characters I've grown fond of suffer more and more? Final Fantasy games typically have peaks and valleys in their stories, balancing darker and lighter moments beautifully. Final Fantasy XVI feels content to just sit at the bottom of the valley and never come up for air. I know grim, dark entertainment is in vogue right now, but for where I'm at in my life, I'm just so sick of it. I deal with enough dark, depressing crap in real life and don't want to see any of that in my entertainment where I go to escape from it, especially not in Final Fantasy. Here, I want to see characters going on a fun adventure. And it may not be fair to criticize this game for what it isn't, but when you have a franchise now 16 games deep, spanning 35 plus years that are known for their fantasy whimsy, I don't think that's an outrageous expectation to have. To me, Final Fantasy XVI's story is almost completely devoid of joy and is without question one of my least favorites in the entire franchise. Undeniably, the highlight of Final Fantasy XVI is its combat system, both the traditional combat as Clive and the epic icon fights. I really want to show you how epic the icon fights can get later in the game, but I wouldn't dare spoil those for you. I'll let you experience those for yourself. To begin, let's dive into Clive's combat arsenal. He starts off with a basic attack where you can swing his sword, an ability to shoot small pellets of magic, and also some kind of movement ability depending on which icon you have equipped. As you win fights, you'll earn ability points, and you can spend them to unlock new abilities, both basic attacks and abilities tied to specific icons. It's kind of a slow drip of new abilities, especially new sets of icon abilities, but once you unlock a good chunk of your arsenal, the combat really opens up. It feels incredibly satisfying to take out enemies one by one, whether it be firing off special attacks, zipping between enemies with movement abilities, or building big combos. It all feels fantastic. Flying enemies in particular were really fun to fight for me. You could either zip up to them and fight in midair, or pull them to the ground and hit them that way. It simply never got old. Fighting bigger enemies, including bosses, was even more fun. They all have a stagger meter that, once broken, puts them into a weakened state where they're more susceptible to damage. Building movesets around getting these down as quickly as possible was incredibly satisfying. I always went out of my way to fight the bigger enemies so I could engage with this stagger mechanic even more. Boss fights were even more fun, as not only do you have to engage with the stagger meter longer, but they often incorporate MMO-style mechanics. For example, you might get a warning of where an enemy attack will land, and you need to dodge in time. Oftentimes, you'll even have to contend with two of these at once, making for some exhilarating moments. I ended up completing the hunt board because I loved engaging with the combat system and trying out even harder enemies. I'm pretty well versed in action games, so I didn't find even the S-rank hunts that hard, but I could see how some might. Speaking of which, I want to touch on the difficulty. Out of the gate, you're given two options, story or action. It's essentially the same thing, but with story mode, you're equipped with accessories that automate certain aspects of combat for you, like dodging, using potions, and automating combos. Action mode out of the gate is pretty easy. I only died like 3 times in total in my time playing, and it was to the same enemy 3 times. He had this one-hit kill move that I kept failing to get out of the way of. But other than that, I just never died because I felt the game was pretty easy. Now, when you finish the game, it does unlock Final Fantasy mode, which is more challenging and raises the level cap to 100. I appreciate that this is available. However, I wish it was available out of the gate for players more tuned to action games wanting a sterner challenge. I'm not going to play this game all the way through again anytime soon, so again, it's kind of unfortunate that I couldn't use that right at the beginning. Speaking of accessories and modifying how you play, let's talk about the game's RPG elements and equipment. This aspect of Final Fantasy XVI is so incredibly disappointing. You do level up as you fight enemies, which increases your character stats, but the equipment might as well not be there at all. The only thing that differentiates one sword from another is the damage and stagger number. That's it. No unique elemental properties or increased critical strike chance, nothing like that. And the same goes for your belt and bracers. It felt so weird to replace an epic sword with a common one just because the damage stat was a little bit higher. In this respect, Final Fantasy XVI almost isn't an RPG. In fact, if you took out gear and levels and scaled enemies accordingly, I feel like this game wouldn't change at all. And to say that about a mainline numbered Final Fantasy, one of the most storied RPG franchises in the entire industry, is really sad. This also makes exploration feel hollow. As you explore the world, there's dozens of shiny objects scattered all over the place, but they barely feel like they're worth picking up because of how the equipment system works. Oh wow, a whole 5 gil, thanks a lot. A part for crafting, good thing I have 500 of those already. By the end of the the game, I think I had close to 500,000 gil because outside of potions and the occasional equipment upgrade, there's really nothing to spend money on. It all feels like a facade. This ends up bleeding over to side quests as well. There's a handful that are interesting, like the one with the wolf and the boy. If you've played the game, you know which one I'm talking about, but the rest were kind of standard, boring, kill 10 of these, collect 5 of this. Unless the side quest had a plus sign, meaning you're rewarded with a meaningful upgrade like extra potions that you can carry, then I started skipping them. It just wasn't worth it to me after a while. Now let's get back to the combat, in particular icon fights, because man, these are epic. There are so many of these throughout the game and they're all giant spectacles. Sometimes they can be a slugfest, but oftentimes you're flying around huge levels with all kinds of crazy nonsense happening. Again, it's really hard to talk about these in detail without spoiling anything, but to say the least, they're a big highlight of the game. I will say that sometimes they can feel extremely on rails with the large amount of QTE events. It's almost like the development team wanted you to participate in something epic, but didn't quite know how to design those moments to happen in real time. Regardless, the icon fights are awe-inspiring, and it's pretty incredible just how many the development team were able to include in the game and how unique each one felt. From a production value standpoint, Final Fantasy XVI feels like one of the most expensive games I've ever played. Every corner of this game is just oozing with quality and polish. From the facial animations during cutscenes to the meticulous design of each environment, it's kind of amazing that this game exists at all. I shudder to think what the total development cost of this game ended up being. And just as a point of reference, I booted up Witcher 3 recently after finishing Final Fantasy XVI, and this is a game that came out 8 years ago and was the pinnacle of RPGs at the time, and it's incredible how dated it looks and feels compared to Final Fantasy XVI. The facial animations here are amongst the best in the industry, second only to probably Naughty Dog. You can really feel every subtlety of each character's facial expression. This is aided by incredible performances across the board. I genuinely don't think there's a weak actor in the whole cast. And speaking of weak, let's talk about Final Fantasy XVI's performance. It's a real shame that this game looks this good but runs as poorly as it does, especially considering the game had been content complete and in the polishing phase for quite a while. Now, I'm not a technical expert, so I don't know exactly what's going on under the hood that's preventing it from running at a solid 60 frames per second, but it feels like a game that should be capable of that, especially considering it's a PS5 exclusive. In fidelity mode, it runs at a locked 30 frames per second with a higher resolution, but suffers from some nasty motion blur. Thankfully, a patch that'll be out by the time this review is now gives you the option to adjust that. Now, I played in performance mode, and while it runs at 60 frames per second in combat, it mostly hovers around 40 while walking around the world. It doesn't take away from the experience in any major way, but it is a shame that Square wasn't able to get it running at a solid 60 frames per second at launch. Lastly, but certainly not least, we need to touch on the incredible soundtrack from composer Masayoshi Soken. Final Fantasy XIV players will be very familiar with his work and overall style, but this was really my first time experiencing his music. It's undeniably good, setting the tone perfectly for each moment. But that's just it. It's more tone setting. The tracks here in 16 are much more moody than melodic. Outside of the battle themes, I can't really remember any song in particular. Not that this is a bad thing, it's just a totally different approach. Personally, I prefer the melodic styles of Yoko Shimomura and Nobuo Uematsu. Their work will be ingrained in my mind forever, and I'm not sure I'll be saying the same thing about Final Fantasy XVI's music. Final Fantasy XVI is an incredibly well-made game with a lot of high production value that is going to satisfy a lot of players. However, after spending around 37 hours to complete the hunt board, craft the best weapon, and finish the game, I think I've come to the conclusion that Final Fantasy XVI just isn't a game for me. It almost completely strips out all RPG elements the series is known for, overindulges on spectacle, and tells a story so unrelentingly grim that I almost stopped playing altogether. The development team at Square Enix obviously had a clear vision for what they wanted to make here, and where they feel like they needed to take the series to keep it relevant. Final Fantasy has always been about changing up the formula in big ways from one entry to the next. However, I feel like they pushed it just a little too far here. Personally, I like what they're doing with the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy way more than what they've done here with 16. Only time will tell what's in store next for Final Fantasy, but I really hope this isn't the direction the mainline series is headed, because if it is, I don't know if I'll be a part of it. Now, while this was the landmark JRPG of 2023, there's plenty of other great ones that released this year. And if you want to check out my reviews for all the other JRPGs that came out in 2023, click on this playlist right here. And special thanks to Reset Switch, Tyler Kuzawa, and the Miyazaki Man for supporting me over on Patreon. To get exclusive videos and other cool perks, consider supporting me over on patreon.com/thegaming shelf. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.